Thank you all for attending this panel discussion tonight entitled From Protest to Policy, A Path to Change After Stockley. My name is Elise Miller. I'm the president of the St. Louis Young Democrats, and I'm also your moderator tonight. We're honored to have you here with us. I'd like to thank our esteemed panelists and Harris Stowe State University for being our gracious hosts today, including President Dwan Wormack, so thank you to them. I'd also like to thank our sign language interpreters, videographer, photographer, and volunteers this evening. And most of all, I'd like to thank my fellow St. Louis Young Democrats board members, Vice President Shane Perpeisel, Secretary Rosetta Okusin-Reb, Treasurer Sam Nurenberger, and Directors Joe Jovanovich, Maggie Lawler, and Joe Wilson for their very hard work this past week to make tonight possible. We also want to take a moment to thank all of you here and all of the many activists across the St. Louis region that have been protesting over the past 3 weeks. To quote Martin Luther King, let's give a round of applause. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. Without the hard work of the protest organizers and the willingness of St. Louis community members to march for justice, we would not be sitting here today. The objective of tonight's discussion is to bring together community leaders who, through their role in advocacy and governmental organizations, have the ability to influence and enact policies that address the racial disparities in our region. We hope that this conversation will bring greater clarity as to what our initial policy priorities should be, and more importantly, how the organizations represented on this stage can work together to achieve these immediate goals. We recognize that the panelists represent only a few of the many organizations seeking to advance racial justice in our region, and we know this is but one conversation of many that have been happening and will continue to happen. If you'd like to tweet about the conversation tonight, we ask that you use the hashtags #PathToChangeSTL, that's path2ChangeSTL, and hashtag #BeTheChange. Passing meaningful legislation or changing the culture of any organization, particularly those that are large and bureaucratic, like our government, judicial system, and police force, is a daunting and difficult, but necessary task. Rather than focus on the barriers to change, tonight we want to focus on the first steps our government and community leaders can take to create the transformational change that is demanded by citizens, protesters, and advocacy groups. There will be 3 sections of the panel. In the first section, panelists will have 3 minutes to introduce themselves and 1.5 minutes to answer each question posed to them. You'll notice Joe Wilson is our timekeeper. He'll hold up cards that show you 30 seconds left and when it's time to stop. Joe's great. Please be mindful of when your time has ended. In the second section of the discussion, I will ask each panelist to pose a question to the group of panelists. Again, you will have 1.5 minutes to answer. And in the third and final section of the discussion, we will ask questions that we received before the event on social media and questions from you, our audience members, on the note cards that were available in the sign-in table. If you need note cards, please let us know and our ushers will bring you one. So look out for those ushers as well around 8 p.m. after the first section, and they will come and collect your questions so that your voices may be heard. Let's begin. So first, I'd like to ask the panelists to introduce themselves and the mission of their organization. Sergeant Taylor, could you start us off?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you guys for coming out. As she stated, I'm Heather Taylor. I'm with the Ethical Society of Police. I'm the current elected president of Ethical. Are we going into our 3-minute introduction?
Go for it.
Oh, okay. So Ethical has been around since the late 60s. Officially became an organization in the early 70s, so we've been around for quite a while. We started essentially because of racism within our police department. and the racism that was occurring and the manner in which we, as police officers with the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, policed our community. Some of the issues that were happening in the 60s and the 70s are similar to what we're dealing with right now. Things that we've seen through the protests, we've seen through the verdict of the not guilty verdict with Jason Stockley, and other things around the country. So we created this organization, where our four founders created this organization to connect our community, to be accountable, and sometimes along the way, we've lost our way, and at the same time, I think our organization has come a long way with standing up for what's right and trying to seek accountability, which is very, very difficult, as many of you know. So ultimately, our goal is to connect with our community, and many of you know who know us know that we're heavily involved in our community. Some events, we love you too. Some of our events, are geared towards our kids, because our kids are our most valuable resource that we have. And until our police department gets on board with, and our city government gets on board with being accountable to how we police each other and how we interact and provide resources to combat systemic problems, I really don't think that we can move forward and change anything until everybody is held accountable, both in government and us in law enforcement. And that's pretty much all I have to say.
Thank you.
My name is Bruce Franks. I'm the state representative for the 78th District. But before I was state rep, I was frontline protester on August 9th, 2014. And before that, I was a black man, and I always will be. And it's very important in my position because I am the state rep. It is 163 of us. It's 46 Democrats. We're in the super minority. And it's my job to go to Jefferson City and not only represent my constituents, but fight for those who can't fight for themselves or who don't know how to fight for themselves and have a voice down in Jeff City that they didn't know that they had. Being in Jeff City is monumental for me because I'm from 4300 Gibson. And to think that a kid from the south side of St. Louis, from the hood, could be in Jeff City, creating legislation, fighting for the people, we don't see that too often. And I'm in a place where just 50, 60 years ago, we was fighting for the right to vote. Just 100-some years ago, we wasn't even allowed in this building. So to be able to be there, and my only mission is to bring power back to the people and dismantle this systemic racism and systematic issues that go on that was built on the foundation of our country and this state of Missouri. So.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. I'm Lida Crewson. I have been the mayor of St. Louis for just a little more than 5 months. And so that's a short time. I heard somebody say, ooh, that's a short time. I want to begin by thanking the Young Dems for putting this forum together. I think it's a much needed forum, and I appreciate being able to be included in it. So thank you to the Young Dems for that. I look forward really to sharing ideas with all the panelists who are here, excuse me, so that we can really talk about a path to change for St. Louis. The dialogue, I think, is extremely important that we have that, because I think that without dialogue, we won't be on a path to change for St. Louis, which we desperately do need to be on. So I look forward to engaging with the panelists here, but also with each and every one of you to the extent that we can, so that we can work together to really implement some of the very serious policy changes that we need to implement and the actions that we need to implement in order to attack the systemic racism that exists in our city, in our state, and in our country today. So thank you for having me here, and I look forward to visiting with you more.
Good evening, everyone. So my name is David Dwight. I'm the Communications and Strategy Catalyst at Forward Through Ferguson. I'm just entering my 7th year here. I originally moved to St. Louis as a student at Washington University, majoring in biomedical engineering, which is not quite what I'm doing now. But in my senior year was when Michael Brown was killed. And so I also count the protests and those that raise these issues as the reason why I'm here. And so as students were returning to classes that year at colleges in St. Louis, we formed an organization, St. Louis Students Solidarity, to really to do a walkout on that first day of classes and really think about the ways that our educational institutions were treating people of color on campuses and their role in racism across St. Louis. And so after graduating, met Brittany Packnett and had the opportunity to work with the commission as a fellow, and really chose to dig into work here because I have to be clear, St. Louis has been an innovator in racism across its history. From the Missouri Compromise to restrictive covenants to several Supreme Court cases that didn't rule favorably on race. All of these things happened here in St. Louis. We delayed implementing DSEG until over 20 years after Brown v. Board. But because of all those reasons is why I stay. I believe in St. Louis and our power to really address the root causes here in St. Louis, and if we can solve them here, we can solve them anywhere in the country. I honestly believe that, and so I had the honor of working with the commission as a fellow and to be witness to that process, to travel across the region and meet residents and hear their concerns and these urgent issues that they face in their life. And was really grateful to have learned. I worked with the Citizen Law Enforcement Relation Working Group and then helped to build the report. But I'm just thankful for that unflinching lens that they took, and in a way that no other commission following racial unrest had in the history of this nation. They had the most open and transparent process, and really went beyond just criminal justice and beyond just Ferguson as one municipality to recognize that these are regional issues that we have to face if we're going to move forward. And so I really believe that this is not a time where we can use confusion about what should happen next, or even debate whether there is a problem as a tactic for avoidance of actually addressing the urgent work and accountability to communities of color that needs to happen here in St. Louis. And so I believe, like our co-chairs, Forward Through Ferguson said, this is a time for action on racial equity and really putting us on the path to where outcomes cannot be predicted by race. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
A few housekeeping notes. For those of you who are on the edges of your aisles, if you could please try to scooch in to allow room for more people to sit down. And to our panelists, if you could lean into the microphone, the people in the back of the room would appreciate that as well. So next we have a question for Representative Franks. You have been one of the most visible members of the protest movement here in St. Louis over the past few weeks. You're also a lawmaker in Jefferson City. Can you talk to us about the role that the protests play in the policy discussion that we're having tonight?
First off, thank you for this question. One important part of this question is where it says you have been one of the more visible members of the protest movement, and that's only one. It's a group of us that have equal power, that have equal insight, and have equal fight. And they ask who us is us. So when it comes to my position as a state representative, policymaking and the lawmaking process, the truth of the matter is we're the super minority in a body that is pro-police, that doesn't understand that Black Lives Matter. So when it comes to the policy discussion, I can bring the lived experience of not only being marginalized, but being out there in the streets as a protester, as an organizer, to the table to let them know what it's really like, rather than just seeing blurbs or some of the news clips. It's only if they're willing to listen, though, because it says policy discussion, but this discussion will only be open if they truly want to sit down and talk. But it's come to a point now where my only job as a lawmaker and a protester together is to make sure that I stand with the people and make sure we continue doing everything that we've been doing, because the time for discussion is over.
The next question's for Sergeant Taylor. One of the stated goals of the Ethical Society of Police is to focus on community-based policing and improving the relationship between our police force and communities of color. Hoping that you can speak to us a little bit about this and what are the immediate policies or procedures that the police department can enact internally to address these issues.
Let me first say this. You know, my opinion is that how can you solve the problems if you don't understand the people who have the problems? You have to know them first. So, you know, when we talk about community-oriented policing, problem-solving policing, you have to be in a position to put people out there that are from those communities. You have to have trust. And right now, there is a lack of that, and there's a reason for it. You think about the verdict, which was ridiculous. And I know there was a member of the Fraternal Order of Police who stated, you know, who are we to come out? It was irresponsible for us to make a statement about it. But I'll tell you this, if we're being real, what was irresponsible was him killing Anthony Lamar Smith. That was irresponsible. So I'll conclude with this. And I'll say this about community. And I'll say this about community-oriented policing. Bruce, we had a minority recruitment program that was geared towards us connecting people of color with communities where they came from. What did the city do and our police department do? They ended it. We were at 34% African Americans, and now we're at 30% in less than 6 months. It's ridiculous what's going on here. So if you don't have the ability to understand your officers who are minorities and what we need to do in these communities, and I'm not saying that people of other races can't identify. Yes, you can, but you have to be willing to identify. So when we talk about community, and I know my time is up, when we talk about community-oriented policing, you have to have people in place internally that represent that community, number one. Number two, you have to be able to be accountable for your actions. And the last time I checked, our police department has not been very accountable for our actions. We have a former circuit attorney, a current circuit attorney, and Judge Durker who have said, gone on record and said that it's high time that we stop handling our own discipline. The case of Jason Stockley is a prime example. So when we talk about community-oriented policing, it has to start with accountability, and it ends there. Because nobody's going to trust us to come in these communities and start talking to people, whether you're black, white, Asian, or whoever, when you have not been held accountable for your actions and how you treat people.
We're going to move on to our next question now. This one is for David. On September 22nd, Ford through Ferguson issued a statement with the support of 30 community organizations outlining key policy priorities for what you called urgent implementation. Can you briefly describe these calls to action and which of these the city could enact immediately without the support of the state?
Yeah, absolutely. I really want to just repeat that point earlier, that there are actionable things we can do now. This is not a time for excuses or for further studying. We do have answers and a path forward. And so in that original statement, I'll just really quickly, I know I only have a minute and a half, go through some of what these reforms could be. Thank you. So first is around use of force. So really revising our use of force policies and training, as well as the deployment of different weapons like tear gas, the use of pepper spray, as well as the use of batons, need to be reformed, and there are models across the nation for that. Establishing a use of force database, that is something that can be done at the state level, but can also be done locally. Right now, there is a use of force database within the police department that they use, and that there could be action immediately now to make that something public that we can use as accountability measure. There's work around just use of force investigations. As Sergeant Taylor said, moving the investigations for the Force Investigative Unit out of the police department so that they're not investigating themselves. Civilian oversight, strengthening the local COB board, something that can be done locally by the Board of Aldermen. There's also this piece around officer wellness and requiring psychological and bias screenings for all new officers. As well as another piece, I'm getting my time's over, but I'm just going to, as well as another piece in there, which is about providing adequate mental health services for officers. There's a statistic in the report that police officers die 2.5 times more from suicide than from homicides. And so when and the legislature in Missouri is investing time in things like the thin blue line legislation and other things like that, it misses what would actually help officers. Because we know that suicide is a problem, that we don't want officers that have been working in a terrible culture, working really long hours out there on the street, because that's not good for protesters, as we know, and it's also not good for the officers. A few last things: responsive demonstration, developing a comprehensive plan for that, that respects media rights and legal observers and preserves human life, reform to municipal court responses to nonviolent offenses, and this community policing piece, and also starting a 25-year racial equity fund, because we know that this can create $14 billion in the regional economy if we didn't have gaps in wages due to race. And so we have to do an investment up front if we want to reap those dividends. So those are a few things, just a few.
Thanks for getting through all 7 of those. The next question's for Mayor Krewson. You've stated that the Ferguson Commission report is our path forward, and that elected officials must work more swiftly, collaboratively, and transformatively. What policies do you commit to implement to advance racial equity or address the culture of the police department?
Thank you for that question. I absolutely do believe that the Ferguson Commission report is the way forward. The Ferguson Commission report has 189 calls to action. 47 of them are priority calls, and as David just said, they've refined that even more to even the higher priority calls. So I think it is important. We actually passed out copies of the Ferguson Commission report to every alderman in the city and every elected office holder. We passed out reports to all department heads in the city, along with a little note from me that, asked them to read this, digest this. So that's just as a starting point, and I don't want to use up my whole minute and a half, but I'm committed here to independent investigations of the police shootings. So let me just say a few things. We're committed to doing a lot of things and to using the political power of the mayor's office to do those things. Number 1, independent investigation of police shootings and use of force. We're committed to doing that. I've said it a number of times, but I want to say it again because I don't think it's always being heard. We are committed to independent investigations of Now, we are committed to that. Number 2, and there's more than, I'm gonna only list a few of these for you, but I'd like to get through them if I could. I'm committed to strengthening the Civilian Oversight Board, including subpoena power. Number 3, and I know I'm out of time. I won't run over too far. Number 3, we are committed to developing community policing standards with the community and with the police department and our responses to demonstrations. It's important that we don't just pick up the standards from another city and use those standards. They can be a guide, but we need to come together as a city. If we are really going to tackle this, we have to talk with one another. We have to come together to adopt community policing standards, and then we have to hold police department and our citizens accountable to those community policing standards. So, there are a few more things here. And I think I'll be able to work them into another question. Thanks for that. So if I could just address that for 1 minute. So I want to address that for a minute because I was here on this stage months ago, and there was, of course, there was a demand to fire another police chief. We currently have a process in place. To fire. We currently have a, I'd like to visit with you. I'd like to hear what you have to say, and I hope you want to hear what I have to say. So we are going through a process right now to determine who the next police chief will be. I'm going to stop here because I don't think this is productive, but any of you who would like to talk to me more about that, I'd be glad to do that. Thank you.
So now we're going to dig into a policy issue, if that's okay. Use of force, a very important one. So let's chat a little bit about use of force. Law enforcement agencies have policies which dictate the appropriate amount of force in various situations. So the permitted actions on the use of force continuum, as they call it, range from police presence with no force up to lethal force. So my question for all of our panelists tonight is, what policies can be enacted to minimize the use of force in police encounters in a way that protects both citizen and officer safety? And in police encounters where that force is used, how do you believe that these investigations should be handled? We've talked about this a little bit, but if you could delve in more, that would be great. Sure.
So with use of force policies, and actually all around the country, the common narrative is that I was in fear of my life, so I shot and killed someone. And so, I don't know if many people know, I have an aunt that was killed by law enforcement in my freshman year in college. So the idea in some of these instances, we know that this isn't truthful, and that all around the country, the laws that are in place that allows some officers to get away with. There are legitimate officer-involved shootings where I've been shot at in the line of duty, where you have to take action. However, we can't allow the environment that continues where officers are using it as a way to get away with murder. And so what has to happen is that what I think should happen is, considering if someone is unarmed and we have proof that they're unarmed, those investigations, first off, all the investigations can't be handled by police departments. We have shown that we are not capable of handling our own officer-involved shootings and discipline. Let's just put that out there. And so when we have these investigations where an officer has shot an unarmed person, that right there is a problem. If you have someone that a bag of weed is not a death sentence, we have to take it should not lead to a death sentence. And we also have to understand that there are instances where, as an officer, been doing this for 17 years, I've encountered some really bad people. And in the line of duty, when somebody's trying to take your life and you have to defend your life, we have to also stand up for those officers that do it legitimately. But we have to also internally hold those that don't, like Jason Stockley and Brian Bianchi, who's still employed here, accountable. So it starts with policy changes that have to come nationwide, has to come locally, where we don't push these investigations out independently. The second thing is that when you have people who have shot and you see that this has a potential to be a crime and that it is a crime, that we get away from that narrative, I was in fear of my life. If you shoot someone in the back and they're unarmed, how are you in fear of your life? And things like that we have to address, so. Exactly, it sure is. Agreed. Look at the case of the officer who complied several times and one of our own who was shot. And look at the lies we told there, so.
So, So I want to piggyback off one, off the actual statute and the law that we use for the use of force that says an officer has to feel that he's in reasonable danger. That's vague. We don't know what that reasonable, we don't know how that reasonable is defined. And if we just take Jason Stockley, for instance, who at 4 different points from the first time he encountered Anthony Lamar Smith until the time that he shot him showed that he was unreasonable and there was no reason to think that he was in any type of danger. The law shows right there that he should have been charged. So it seems as if we can talk about how to change the policy and the law, but we have to vet the officers better. We have to have a community, a police that directly reflects, the police department that directly reflects the community in which they police. And I agree with the sentiment, the police can't police the police at the end of the day. We've seen it from the time that Michael Brown was killed to the following year. We had an average of a police-involved shooting every single month. We've had an uptick this year since our current interim chief has been chief in police-involved shooting deaths as well in this short months of span that he's been here. So at the end of the day, when we can't come out, there's nobody that bats 1,000. We haven't held anybody accountable. I mean, we're talking about from Kajim Powell to Mansour Ball-Bay to Kerry Ball to Vonderrick Myers to Isaac Holmes to Ladarius Williams to Jarvis Scruggs. So these are all, not every single, you can't look at every single one of these cases, and say that it was justified shooting.
Yeah, and I just add, I agree. And so the only thing that I want to add to what's been said before is the importance that when we're going to change use of force and how the outcomes happen, that means we have to change policy, we have to change culture, and we also have to have real accountability measures. If those 3 things aren't there together, we're not going to actually move ourselves forward. And so an additional thing with use of force continuum and that unreasonable, that standard for using deadly force, there's also de-escalation tactics. So so moving up the use of force continuum towards deadly force is not the only option that officers have, and there's many models of this across the country, where you put the preservation of human life as the #1 thing, both the suspect or the person and the officer, and so they create, well, I mean, the thing is, biases exist for everybody. And so, yeah, no, absolutely. Communities should be policed by police that reflect the demographics of that community, and we can't let ourselves get the easy pass out through diversity. Diversity will not get us to where we need to be. That's step one. It's important, but we can't give ourselves an easy way out. Diversity is not enough. We have to talk about equity, we have to talk about policy and systems change as well.
Mm-hmm. And if I could just add to that for a second, if I could just add to that for a second, I'm going to add to this by saying that it is about hiring more African American officers. So if there are any of you who know a young man or a young woman, it is about hiring more African American officers. It is about better screening. It is about more anti-bias, anti-racism, de-escalation training. These things have to be. Yeah, I heard someone in the audience say there's a black and a white police union. Yeah, I wish that were not the case. But we have a lot of things that we have to do. And part of it has to do with hiring, it has to do with training, it has to do with policy. And we need to make all of those changes. Thank you.
I'd like to make a quick observation. Many of you are speaking about the culture of the police department. That's actually the topic of our next question. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward, thinking about as we are in the process of searching for a new police chief in St. Louis City. In July of 2016, the Ethical Society of Police released a report documenting a lot of the things you guys are talking about. Internal procedures, such as subjective practices for hiring, promotions, disciplinary action that disproportionately affected African American officers. So as we're thinking about how to create an organizational culture within our police department that can address these very important concerns, our panelists, what do you believe that should be the top priorities as we're selecting the next police chief? David, as you're a member of the Citizens Advisory Council, why don't you start us off?
Sure. So I'm one of the co-chairs of the Citizen Advisory Council committee that's helping to advise the selection of the next police chief. And so far this year, we've had 3 forums to make sure that we were getting the voices of the community before we moved forward, to make sure that we were directed by those concerns. And I am so glad by the community members that came out and voiced some of these same concerns that we're talking about here, so that we can't say that we didn't listen later. We know that we heard them and we have to act on it. So in terms of things that the next police chief needs to have, it has to be a guardian mentality rather than a warrior mentality. We have to have a police chief that's really ready for culture change and for leading by example within the department and for holding officers accountable to these new standards. We need a police chief that's really dedicated to community-oriented policing and really instituting it actually, not just how we say it is now. The department says that they do community policing now, but really digging into problem-solving policing. Yeah, those are just a few things, but we need culture change.
Mayor Krewson, you're a key part of this decision. Can you speak to some of the goals that you have?
I can, and first of all, I want to thank David for serving on this very important Citizen Advisory Committee. So thank you, David. And there are 12 other people who serve on it as well. So what do I want in a police chief? I want somebody who's ethical. I want somebody who's fair. I want somebody who cares. I want somebody who cares about I want somebody who cares about all of the people of St. Louis. I want somebody who cares about, I want somebody who cares about the 188 people who were murdered last year and their families. I want someone who cares about those people. I want somebody who's a leader. I want somebody who's experienced. I want somebody who's committed to community policing. And I hope you want somebody who cares about those 188 people. I hope you want somebody who's ethical and who's fair. Thank you.
Okay.
Sergeant Taylor, plays a very important role with the Ethical Society of Police, has a very inside look into some of these issues. What do you think about this?
I think with some of the things that the mayor said, we piggyback off of some of those about someone who's going to be fair, ethical. We also need to make sure that that person doesn't come from a background, whoever they are, whether they're white, black, whatever, that they're fair and that they don't come from a background of litigation, meaning that they have been involved in civil rights violations, and that they have a history that's littered with discipline problems, complaints. We can't have that. So whoever this choice will be, whether they're outside or inside, that this person, I hate to tell you guys, but when I get 20, I'm running out the door. But on top of that, I want to do other work within our community that's going to help our community. I'm not a politician. I'm none of that. I'm going to stay committed to our community, and that's what I'm going to do in my retirement. So, and it won't involve politics. So, what we want in that position is someone that's going to understand, that has a history with community-oriented policing, that understands problem solving, that understands the importance of diversity, that understands the importance of having women in positions, having minorities in positions. Those things are so critical to our police department, and we can't have people in place, whoever this choice will be, that doesn't understand and doesn't put in place problem-solving forms of policing, because we're going to be right back where we started, and which is a mess, because that's what it is now. Unfortunately, it is what it is. But so we need to have someone in place that doesn't have that history of litigation, doesn't have a disciplinary track record, like that's horrible, so that's going to eliminate several candidates within our department. So, and someone that understands community-oriented policing and really will implement it.
Representative Franks, do you want to weigh in?
So I think that I've heard what everybody said about what they want in a police chief. I actually don't think the first search should be for police chief. We need a public safety director, full-time public safety director. It's hard the police chief is accountable to the public safety director. So if we don't have the police chief's boss, then it's kind of hard to hold anybody accountable. When we have the right public safety director, it don't matter, don't matter who you put as chief, because they're going to be able to hold that person accountable. So I think more importantly, although it's pretty cool, we looking, doing this big search for a police chief, I honestly think the first thing we need to do is get a full-time public safety director.
So taking a few steps back here, I'd like to discuss a little bit more about some of the root causes that perpetuate the inequity that leads to these situations. And so when considering policy reforms that we should pursue in our region, what do you see as the priorities for increasing economic opportunities, reducing educational disparities, and how have you really engaged in change efforts in these areas? Do you have any promising success stories locally?
So let me just respond to a couple of things that Representative Frank said. and that is that we certainly do need a director of public safety, and that's something that we're working on now. We also, though, do need a police chief. I think your question had to do with what sort of cultural changes we expect to see. Can you repeat that part of it? It was about a three-part question, was it not?
Sure. So
Quickly.
just thinking about, you know, in St. Louis, when we're
Right.
thinking about the root causes of
Right.
crime.
Deep generational poverty, poor educational system over decades. This isn't something that happened in the last 5 months or the last 5 years, but it happened over 50 years. So deep generational poverty, a struggling educational system. I mean, we need more early childhood education. We need more after-school programs for kids. We need more recreation programs for kids. We need more summer jobs and after-school jobs for kids. We need things on the prevention. We need things on the prevention side of this equation just as much as we need on the law enforcement side. So we need to, one of the things that we've recently implemented is SLATE. If you all are familiar with SLATE, SLATE has a new program. This is anecdotal, but SLATE has a new program to skill up 500 people within the next 100 days. If you know somebody who needs a job, SLATE is now open 7 in the morning till 7 at night, every single day, and so we need a whole lot of things. You know what happens when our social systems fail, when our school system fails, when our educational system, when our social systems fail, these issues land at the feet of police officers.
David, it looked like you wanted to speak on this topic.
Sure. So I was just going to say that, you know, so often when we're trying to deal with crime, our immediate place that we put more money into is policing. We put a lot of money into the arrest incarcerate model and expect that to solve poverty. But they've done studies nationally, investing more money in police departments does not lower crime. It doesn't solve these underlying issues. And so the commission knew that. And so when they were creating their recommendations, it wasn't just the Justice for All section, which was about policing and about municipal courts, but they extended it beyond that and said, we have to look at making sure that all St. Louis residents have the opportunity to thrive, and that we're putting youth at the center of our decision making. And so that means investing money, thinking about public safety more broadly, redefining how we think about public safety, which I appreciate what Bruce said about the focus on public safety and having that role be important, but thinking about it in a new way that's not defined by arrest incarcerate, that invests money into our communities, into communities that have been disinvested, and ensuring that, yeah, people have not just jobs, but a career path, that we're building family wealth. All of these things are vitally important, and we're not going to reduce crime without doing those things and really investing in people.
Representative Franks, would you like to go ahead?
Yes. The question of what do you see as the top priorities to increase economic opportunity and reduce educational disparities, I think one way we can do it is by simply concentrating on the community. Each and every person in here has resources. And the more we use each other for our resources, we can show the government that we don't need them. We can show all of these other entities that we don't need them, and we could come together to not only help provide jobs in our community, because our small businesses are the ones that's been providing jobs for over a long period of time, as well as education. When we think about what our kids are being taught in school, and I went to Lindbergh High School, which was a great school, but I didn't learn much about where I came from. I didn't learn much about my particular history. So by us being able to educate ourselves and homeschool and find the right curriculum, where we can do it in our community centers and so on and so forth, by showing the government that we can do it. Because they'll come running when we show them that we can survive without them. And one other thing, they talk about, and are there any promising success stories? Well, it is, because we have Dr. Alice Prince, that Mayor Lida Crewson appointed to slate. Now, we talk about programs. Now, this ain't the same slate as we remember. It ain't the same as the same old. We're talking about innovative programs that have shown to be national models, that we connect real folks with real jobs each and every day, where we're doing the mentoring, we're doing everything we need to do within the community. So for all those folks that say protesters don't have jobs, and the ones that say that, well, how do you combat black-on-black crime? Well, this is how we combat the crime in our community, by providing the resources and allocating them in the right spots.
Sergeant Taylor.
Well, on this topic, some of the things that are most important from a standpoint, you know, I am from this city of St. Louis, this community, Vashon High School, by the way, guys. So the things that you need, that we have to address, they start with poverty or improving our educational system. And it's very important for us to, as communities, to mentor our children within these communities, because number one resource will always be children, you know, and how we raise them, what we give them. It's important for us to always grab someone and bring them forward to mentor them. And things like that, it may seem kind of liberal and kind of vague, but it's actually true. It's important that we educate our kids so that they can have sustainable jobs, careers, and futures. And the only way to do that is to have an educational system that's in place that's really about giving them a valuable education, so that when they take the ACTs, the SATs, that they can pass these things and then get into school where, you know, they place higher and to get funding for education and things like that. And when you have communities, when our school system, the accreditation wasn't there, and that's problematic for our kids who then go away to college and these different universities. We haven't received the same level of education like as Lindbergh that Vashon might have had. St. Peter's too. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the teachers are less than, it's not that, but it's so many obstacles that they have to overcome that, you know, a lot of minorities that we have to overcome in these systems. So, you know, from my standpoint, it's important that we invest in our kids, educating them, helping them, giving them resources so that they can get out of impoverished situations, so they in turn can give back like we all should.
Thank you. For our final question in this section, I want to think a little bit more about, we have so many people here tonight, so many.
Can I just say one more?
Please, go ahead.
Last one. Sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to, this is something that as the commission looked at all the way that people of color in St. Louis have disparate outcomes in every single sector in life, you know, in education, in health, in all of these spaces. So I just want to say, I believe in the power of programs to help individuals, but if we're going to have generational change, which we know to fix these issues where there's 30-year life gaps across because of where you're born in St. Louis, from a black neighborhood to a white neighborhood, it can't just be programmatic change. That's not enough, and that's not what black people in St. Louis deserve. They deserve systems that treat them and give them the outcomes that they need to. So I just want to add programs, and also we have to fix our policies and systems.
Thank you. So we'll limit our panelists' response on this question to 1 minute, although it is a really important question, and I think it's one that I've been thinking a lot about over the last couple weeks. And it's about how can the organizations who are represented on this stage, and how can all the people in the audience as well, work together to advance these policy priorities that we're discussing tonight. Who wants to take that one?
So real quick, I answer this. This is what I'll say to the question. As it pertains to working together, Ethical Society and I have been working together before I was ever elected. As far as the other powers that be, the mayor's office, the only way we can truly work together is by doing something. Because you don't need a list of demands from us. We know what the demands are. We know what the issues are. We know what the problems are. But at the end of the day, there's no list of demands or tangible legislation that you could put forward to understand why we're out here in the first place, because we're having this very panel discussion because of a verdict that came down, because of a police-involved shooting, period. So at the end of the day, when we say that our only demand is for y'all to stop killing us, like you have to feel that first before we can talk about anything else moving forward.
So do you see,
Mayor Krewson, would you like to respond?
thank you. So certainly, I want to open and willing to work with you, to work with to work with ESOP, to work with the Ferguson Commission and all of you here. And so I think that for us to really make the systemic change that we need to make, we have to come together and work together. And I'm certainly happy to work with you, and I hope that you'll be happy to work with me as well.
So I'm sorry, I'm not trying to, but this is the thing. You know that one of the first, mic check. So one of the first things that happened when the mayoral race came around, I met with every single candidate, correct?
Well, you met with me. I
Yeah,
know that.
well,
Thank
I
you
met
for
with
that.
every single candidate,
Right.
and even after you had won, I met with you as well.
Correct.
And I've always agreed to work with you. I came into your office and everything else.
Right. And I'm still.
Now we're at a point where we have report after report after report. We have disparity study after disparity study after disparity study, and nothing has been implemented. So at the end of the day, like I'm willing to work, but now we're at a critical point now where we even have. They keep saying, and I'm not trying to alienate the conversation. I promise I'm not. But they keep saying fire O'Toole, and I understand that the way it's coming at you, it's a lot of people saying it. But let me break it down. So when you remove a police chief, and you say we want to move in a different direction, and this is direction that we move in.
And that's why we have a search underway.
So absolutely. So at the end of the day, hold on, y'all. So at the end of the day, you put Chief Lawrence O'Toole as the interim chief. So when you put him as the interim chief, and we see that we have 2 cases that involve black officers that have been covered up, we have an uptick in police-involved shootings. We've heard his rhetoric, and not only his rhetoric, the way that he's handled the protests the last 3 weeks. This is more than enough reason to not continue on this slippery slope with him as interim chief.
Thank you all. As you know, we have a police search process underway. This is the first time in the history of our city, the first time ever that this is the first time in the history of our city that we have done a search for a police chief, ever, in 165 years. So we have a process that's ongoing. David's on that committee. There are 12 other people on that committee.
So
In a few months, we will make a determination based on, I'd love to answer the question, but I don't think maybe we should meet on this privately and talk about it. Then let me answer the question.
You address the police chief's search. We're talking about, I'm not talking about the police chief search. We're talking about the interim chief. And we know there are months to come, where we're gonna pick a new chief, but we still have this interim chief who's detrimental to everything that's going on.
I guess the other thing that I would say is that I am not going to discuss a personnel matter in a public hearing. I don't think it's appropriate.
This seems like a good time to take a pause.
Hopefully this discussion can be productive, because what we're trying to do here is trying to find a path to change. That's what we're trying to do here. Thank you all for your enthusiasm.
Thank you all. Thank you. As all of us know, we're here discussing very important issues tonight. And really the goal of what we're trying to do is to bring the policymakers together and have this conversation in public so that every single person in this room can bear witness to what's said tonight and hold our community leaders and our elected officials accountable. And so in this next section, we actually asked the panelists to ask a question to each other. So for those of you who do have a question you'd like to ask and you wrote down on the note card, actually some of our ushers will be walking around. So we would love to hear your voice. But first, we're going to have this conversation coming from the panelists themselves. So David, would you like to begin?
Sure. So my question for the rest of the panel is that what Ford through Ferguson and what the Ferguson Commission are talking about is transformational change. So creating a St. Louis that doesn't look like today, that's not defined by our status quo, that's not defined by the racism of today. And what we know is that if you're trying to get to another place across the city, and you don't know where you are now and you don't know where you're going, those directions are going to be meaningless. So if we don't completely understand where we are now in our history and also have an idea of what that transforms St. Louis that's not defined by business as usual politics of today, we can't move forward. And so my question for the panel is, tell me about your vision of a transformed St. Louis and what that looks like, and then do you honestly believe that your actions now are aligned with that vision?
Mayor Krewson, would you like to begin?
Sure. Thanks for the question. I mean, I think that my goal is to have a more equitable St. Louis. My goal is to have a St. Louis where kids grow up in safe neighborhoods, where kids have a chance for a good education, where kids have a chance for good job training, where those young people, where, no, not white kids, all kids, black kids, white kids, Asian kids. So that's certainly, I am. Thank you. And I do think that our actions now are aligned with creating a better St. Louis. I don't think we will. So you know, I'll let somebody else answer the question because I don't really think they want to hear from me, so I'll let somebody else take the question.
Representative Franks.
Hey, Dave, could you repeat that last part of the question?
Yeah, it was just when we talk about moving forward as St. Louis, we say it's important to know where we're going, right, and to understand where we are now in our history. So just asking, like, what's your vision of a transformed St. Louis that's not defined by these racist policies of today? And then just talk about your actions today in that context.
So I think the most important, I think the most important actions that are being taken right now about the folks that's hitting the streets, because we've had discussion after discussion about policy, and we've had this discussion for 3 years.
Sure.
Since August 9th, 2014, folks been coming to the table, and we've had report after report, and still nothing has been done to transform where we need to be. So I think by hitting the streets and by letting the status quo and everybody else know that we're not going anywhere, that we're going to continue to affect the economy, and that we're going to continue to disrupt until. And until means until, because we haven't gotten any, we feel like we haven't gotten anything, right? We feel like we haven't gotten anywhere in 3 years. So coming to the table right now real fast for something that will appease a few people, no, we're not going for that. So we're here for the long haul. So that's the most important action to me right now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sergeant Taylor.
So I wrote down some things here. Some of the first things that we need to understand is that throughout our country, we've been about enforcement, prison, and we're not about rehabilitating people. So if we're really trying to change this city, we're going to have to, and it seems a lot of people look at it, oh, this is liberal, this is, oh, that's never going to work. Yes, it will. What we've been doing for decades, you know, all my life is seeing people placed in a prison system that hasn't rehabilitated them. It's brought them into it, and it's kept them into it. It's high time that we start rehabilitating people. We make people better criminals, more violent. So we have to do something with that. And I'm one of the, I wouldn't know how to begin with it, but I know that it's not working. So education, let's talk about education. Let's talk about the school to prison pipeline. We have kids who are in our education system who are in these schools who are disciplined worse than their white counterparts in schools, and that's a problem. You know, kids who have social economic issues, who are living in poverty, who haven't been well adjusted, and we're sending them to detention. We're making them a problem before we address the underlying issues that they have. I want to move on to jobs and Slate. I appreciate Dr. Alice Prince. I appreciate the mayor for placing her there. That's something that we can look forward to. That's a positive going forward. And I'll wrap up. The other thing is police accountability. Police accountability. It has to be there across the board. And let me state this. Just because someone is an African-American officer doesn't mean that they're a good officer. Just because And just because someone's a white officer doesn't mean that they're a bad officer. We have to start doing better with how we're hiring people and implementing implicit bias screening. It has to be detailed, effective, and it has to continue throughout that hiring process, because we may miss someone, and we may have someone like a Jason Stockley that gets through the system, and that's the problem. So and the black Darren Wilson too. We prosecuted him too. So, so these are the points that I think are important for change and changing our city. And I hope, a decade from now that we'll see some of these changes and we're progressive with getting them done. I think it's going to take about that long.
Sergeant Taylor, do you want to go ahead and ask your question now?
I think with your question there, I think it's it will take a while. We have some people in our department that have to go. We have some people who are in city government who have to go. We have some people in our education system that have to go. But I'll go on to my question. My question was to address to the panel is that recently Judge Durker came out and said that it was high time that the police department, in a St. Louis Post-Dispatch article, that the police department no longer handles its own discipline. We also had the current circuit attorney who has concerns about how we're handling officer-involved shootings. We also had the prior circuit attorney, Jennifer Joyce, who also stated that the way we handle discipline, specifically officer-involved shootings, is a problem. So my question to the panel here is, what are your thoughts on that? What are you doing to remedy how we're handling them? Because we obviously have a problem.
So, can I take this one? Okay, first, thank you. So I agree that we have to have independent investigation of police-involved shootings and use of force. And the Ferguson Commission report, there are different opinions about who should do that. Should it be the Attorney General? Should it be the Highway Patrol? Should it be Kim Gardner's office? We have to come together, figure out where we're going to place that responsibility, and then make that happen. We also need to strengthen the Civilian Oversight Board. We've talked about that already. But those are just two of the things. We have sort of short-term and long-term changes, I think, that need to be made here. So, but we have to start. So, thank you.
So, yeah, I'll answer. So to answer the question, about the investigations, for one, let me answer this. I got it. I think that, for one, the Attorney General cannot effectively investigate anything when it comes to our police department and in the city of St. Louis. I know what I'm saying. Yeah, I'm not saying that you said that. I was just saying that's just my personal opinion, because we've been given the options. And we've already seen that the police can't effectively police themselves, even before they had the Force Investigative Unit. In one particular case, we talk about Kerry Ball Jr. This is a case that not only is dear to me, but I read this 252-page report. And when I read this 252-page report, I got with another pathologist and a forensic specialist and a prosecutor, and he was able to come up with a totally different account of what happened, simply coming off the information that came from the police report from those officers, and it's evidence there. And even when they tried to give it to the feds, and Richard Callahan came out and said that, well, the reason why this was credible was because there were too many discrepancies in the story, when if you read the stories and all the witnesses, this is one of the only times that all of the witnesses have coincided with each other, that comes from different parts of the city, different nationalities. So at the end of the day, I think just like we have a major crime unit, we need to have that same thing come together, and it needs to be ran by our circuit attorney.
Thank you for sharing that. Unfortunately, we see this too many times in our city.